The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Cedar. Ridge's 14-year-old Tommy Sullivan crouched behind a weathered wooden crate outside Morrison's general store. His calloused hands trembled as he shared the last piece of stale bread with Rex, a scraggly brown mutt whose ribs showed through his matted fur. The dog's amber eyes held the same hunger that gnawed at Tommy's stomach. "Easy there, boy," Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from the dry desert air. "We'll find something better tomorrow." Cedar Ridge in 1882 was a town that chewed up the weak and spat them out into the unforgiving wasteland beyond. Tommy had learned this harsh truth when fever took his parents 3 years ago, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to survive that burned brighter than the desert sun. The wooden boardwalk creaked ominously as heavy boots approached. Tommy's heart sank as he recognized the distinctive jingle of spurs belonging to Sheriff Clayton Wade, a man whose moral compass pointed wherever the highest bidder wanted it to. "Well, well, what have we here?" Wade's gravelly voice carried the sea smugness of a man drunk on borrowed power. Behind him stood 2 of Ezra Blackwood's hired guns, their hands resting casually on their holsters. Tommy slowly stood, Rex growling low at his side. "Afternoon, Sheriff." "Just resting in the shade." Wade's weathered face twisted into a cruel smile. "Funny thing, boy. Old Morrison says someone's been stealing from his store. Bread, jerky, that sort of thing." He stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "I haven't stolen anything," Tommy said, meeting Wade's steely gaze despite the fear churning in his gut. "I work odd jobs when I can find them." "Search him," Wade ordered. Of Blackwood's men roughly grabbed Tommy's arm and began searching his pockets. With practiced efficiency, he produced a small cloth bundle and unwrapped it to reveal a piece of jerky. "Well, I'll be damned," Wade said with mock surprise. "Looks like we caught ourselves a thief." Tommy's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's not mine. You planted that." The second gunman backhanded Tommy across the face, sending him stumbling backward. Rex barked furiously and lunged forward, but a swift kick sent the loyal dog yelping into the dust. "Rex!" Tommy cried out, rushing to his companion's side. Wade loomed over them both. "Here's how this is going to work, boy. You and that mangy mutt have 1 hour to get out of Cedar Ridge. If I see either of you after that ... He let the threat hang in the air like the dust kicked up by a passing stagecoach dot as the men walked away, their laughter echoing off the adobe buildings. Tommy gathered Rex in his arms. The dog whimpered but licked Tommy's face, offering what comfort he could. "It's all right, boy," Tommy whispered, though his voice cracked with emotion. "We'll figure something out." "We always do." But as he looked out at the vast expanse of desert, stretching beyond the town's limits, where the heat shimmered like liquid silver, and the nearest settlement lay 2 days' hard travel away, Tommy felt something he'd refused to acknowledge in 3 years of hardship: true despair. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the jagged mountains on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Tommy of the fire that had claimed so many dreams in this unforgiving land. With Rex limping beside him, he gathered their meager possessions and began the long walk into an uncertain future, leaving behind the only home he'd known since becoming an orphan. Behind them, the windows of Cedar Ridge's buildings reflected the dying light like the eyes of predators watching their prey disappear into the wilderness. The desert night was a creature of contradictions, bone-chilling cold that followed the day's scorching heat. Tommy huddled against a large boulder 3 miles outside Cedar Ridge, his arms wrapped around Rex for warmth. The dog's breathing was labored from their forced march across the rocky terrain, and Tommy could feel his companion's body trembling. "Just hold on, Rex," Tommy murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the dog or himself. Come morning, we'll find water. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Tommy's blood run cold. In this lawless territory, night riders rarely brought good news. He pressed himself deeper into the shadow of the boulder, praying that whoever was coming would pass by without noticing them. But the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. "Hello there," called a cultured voice with a distinctly Eastern accent. "I saw your small fire from the ridge. Are you in need of assistance?" Tommy remained silent, every instinct screaming danger. Rex, however, lifted his head and let out a weak whimper. "I'm not armed," the stranger continued, and Tommy could hear the genuine concern in his voice. "Well, not with any intention of harm, anyway. I have water and food if you need them." Desperation finally overcame caution. We could use some water," Tommy called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The man dismounted, and in the moonlight, Tommy could see he was nothing like the rough cowboys and miners who populated this region. He wore a fine wool coat despite the heat, and his boots were polished leather rather than worn hide. Most striking of all was his bearing, confident but not arrogant, commanding but somehow gentle. "My name is Jeremiah Montgomery," the man said, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "And you are?" "Tommy Sullivan. This is Rex." Montgomery knelt down beside them, and Tommy could see kind eyes and a face lined by years of hard decisions and harder responsibilities. Without ceremony, Montgomery pulled a leather water skin from his saddle and offered it to Tommy Dot. The water was the sweetest thing Tommy had ever tasted. He forced himself to drink slowly, then helped Rex lap at the precious liquid from his cup. "Hands, when did you last eat?" Montgomery asked, studying Tommy's gaunt frame and Rex's protruding ribs. "Yesterday morning," Tommy admitted, shame coloring his voice. Montgomery returned to his horse and retrieved a cloth bundle. Inside were thick slices of bread, dried beef, and cheese, more food than Tommy had seen in weeks. As they ate, Montgomery listened without judgment as Tommy explained their circumstances, from his parents' death to that afternoon's false accusation and banishment. "Ezra Blackwood," Montgomery said when Tommy finished, and there was something dangerous in his tone. "I've heard that name before. He's been acquiring mining claims throughout this territory through questionable means. You know him?" "We've never met, but his reputation precedes him, as does Sheriff Wade's." Montgomery stared into the small fire Tommy had built. "Tell me, Tommy, what do you know about the land north of Cedar Ridge? The area near Copper Creek?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Not much. Folks say it's good grazing land, but Blackwood's been trying to buy it up for mining." "Why?" Montgomery reached into his coat and withdrew a leather document case. From it, he pulled out an official-looking paper with several wax seals. "Because I happen to own a rather substantial piece of property in that area. Purchased it sight unseen from the territorial government last month as an investment." Tommy's eyes widened as he saw the government stamps and signatures. "You're really rich, aren't you?" A sad smile crossed Montgomery's face. "Wealth is a curious thing, son. I've spent most of my life accumulating it, building railroads and businesses across this country. But I've learned that money without purpose is just paper and metal." He looked at Tommy and Rex with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. "Perhaps it's time I found a better purpose for mine." As the fire crackled between them, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But he'd learned not to trust that feeling too quickly. "Why would you want to help us?" Tommy asked quietly. "You don't even know us." Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the star-filled desert sky. "When I was about your age, I lived on the streets of Boston, orphaned, hungry, angry at a world that seemed determined to grind me into dust." His voice carried the weight of old pain. "A man named Samuel Hartwell took me in, gave me work in his shipping company, and eventually made me his partner He saved my life, Tommy, and he taught me that the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates, but what he gives away when it matters most. Rex had fallen asleep against Tommy's side, his breathing finally steady and peaceful. The boy stroked the dog's fur and felt tears threatening to spill over. "What happens now?" Tommy asked. Montgomery folded the deed carefully and returned it to his case. "Now we're going to ride to my property tomorrow and see what we're working with. Then we're going to send a message to Cedar Ridge that some injustices won't be tolerated." For the first time in 3 years, Tommy Sullivan allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Dawn broke over the Arizona Territory with the promise of another scorching day, but Tommy felt a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Montgomery had shared his bedroll with the boy and dog, and for the first time in months, Tommy had slept without one ear open for danger. Montgomery's property stretched across a verdant valley where Copper Creek meandered through cottonwood groves and natural meadows. It was a stark contrast to the harsh desert they'd left behind, a pocket of paradise that seemed almost too good to be true. "This is beautiful," Tommy breathed, watching Rex run freely through the tall grass, his tail wagging for the first time since their expulsion from Cedar Ridge. "It's more than beautiful," Montgomery said, dismounting near the creek. "It's strategic. This water source feeds 3 other streams that supply Cedar Ridge and half the mining claims in the region. Whoever controls this land controls the water rights for 50 square miles. The implications hit Tommy like a physical blow. That's why Blackwood wants it. Precisely. And that's why he's been systematically driving out small landowners and intimidating anyone who might oppose his expansion." Montgomery knelt by the creek and filled his water skin. "But there's one thing Mr. Blackwood doesn't know." "What's that?" Montgomery's smile held the promise of retribution. "This deed was filed with the territorial government last month, which means it takes precedence over any claims Blackwood might have filed since then. And more importantly, it includes water rights in perpetuity." They spent the morning exploring the property, and with each passing hour, Tommy began to understand the true scope of Montgomery's plan. This wasn't just about helping one orphan. Boy, it was about striking a blow against the corruption that had poisoned Cedar Ridge. Around midday, dust clouds on the horizon announced approaching riders. Montgomery and Tommy took cover behind a grove of cottonwoods and watched as Sheriff Wade led a group of 6 men toward their position. "Probably wondering why we haven't died of thirst yet," Tommy muttered. But as the riders drew closer, Tommy realized Wade wasn't leading them. He was following. At the head of the group rode a man whose presence seemed to darken the very air around him. Ezra Blackwood was tall and lean, with silver hair and predator's eyes that missed nothing. His expensive clothes and ornate saddle spoke of wealth, but there was something fundamentally cold about him that no amount of money could warm. "That's him," Tommy whispered. "That's Blackwood." The group stopped near the creek, and Blackwood dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed. "Wade tells me you've had some trouble with a local vagrant," Blackwood said to one of his men, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I want this entire area cleared before my surveyor arrives tomorrow. No witnesses, no complications." "What about the boy?" Wade asked nervously. Blackwood's laugh was like winter wind through dead leaves. "The desert has a way of solving problems like that. If he and his mutt survive the night, they won't survive another." Montgomery's jaw tightened, and Tommy saw something dangerous flash in the businessman's eyes. Without warning, Montgomery stood and walked boldly into the clearing. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to boardrooms and power, "I believe you're trespassing on private property." The effect was immediate. Hands moved to gun handles, and horses shifted nervously as their riders tensed for violence. But Blackwood simply studied Montgomery with the calculating gaze of a call. Predator sizing up potential prey. Private property? Blackwood repeated. This is open range, friend. Has been for years. Montgomery reached into his coat, slowly, so as not to provoke gunplay, and withdrew the deed. I'm afraid you're mistaken. This land, including the water rights to Copper Creek and its tributaries, belongs to Montgomery Railroad Holdings, as of last month. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. Let me see that. Montgomery approached without fear and handed over the document. As Blackwood examined it, his face grew steadily darker. This is impossible, Blackwood said finally. I've been negotiating for this land for 2 years. Then I suggest you negotiate with me, Montgomery replied smoothly. Of course, first we'll need to discuss your treatment of the previous residents of Cedar Ridge. I understand you've been using rather aggressive tactics to acquire property. Wade's hand was now openly resting on his gun butt. Mr. Blackwood, should we? No, Blackwood said sharply. He studied Montgomery for a long moment, then smiled coldly. Mr. Montgomery, is it? I think you and I should have a conversation. A private one. Tommy watched from the trees as the two men faced off beside the creek, the future of Cedar Ridge. Hanging in the balance between them, Rex pressed against his leg, sensing the tension, and Tommy realized that whatever happened next would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of everyone who had suffered under Blackwood's iron grip. Confrontation was far from over. 3 days later, Tommy Sullivan rode into Cedar Ridge beside Jeremiah Montgomery, no longer a frightened orphan, but a young man with purpose burning in his eyes. Rex trotted alongside Montgomery's horse, his coat gleaming from proper food and care, a leather collar around his neck that bore a small silver tag, a gift from Montgomery that declared him property of Tommy Sullivan, Copper Creek Ranch. The transformation in Tommy was equally striking. Montgomery had insisted on outfitting him with proper clothes from his own travel cases, altered to fit the boy's smaller frame. Clean, well-fed, and riding a gentle moray that Montgomery had purchased. From a ranch outside town, Tommy looked like what he now was, the ward of a wealthy and powerful man. Word of their arrival spread quickly through Cedar Ridge's dusty streets. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores. Miners paused in their conversations, and children pointed in amazement at the impressive procession. At the center of it all rode Montgomery, his bearing radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down railroad barons and corporate titans across 2 continents. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office, where Wade emerged with obvious reluctance. Behind him lurked 2 of Blackwood's men, their hands hovering near their weapons. Sheriff Wade, Montgomery said cordially, dismounting with practiced ease. I believe we have some business to discuss. Wade's face was pale beneath his weathered tan. Now see here, Montgomery, you can't just— Can't what? Montgomery interrupted, his voice still pleasant, but carrying an undertone of steel. Can't seek justice for a 14-year-old boy who was falsely accused and driven into the desert to die? Can't question why evidence was planted on him? Can't wonder about the curious timing of his banishment, just as Mr. Blackwood was finalizing his plans for Copper Creek? A crowd was gathering, drawn by the confrontation and the sight of Tommy's dramatic return. Among the faces, Tommy recognized Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, old Pete who ran the stable, and Sarah Morrison, the general store owner's daughter who had always been kind to him. Tommy? Sarah called out in amazement. We thought you were dead. Tommy dismounted and walked over to her, Rex at his side. Very much alive, Sarah. Thanks to Mr. Montgomery here. Wade stepped forward aggressively. Boy's still a thief. Doesn't matter who's backing him now. Actually, it matters a great deal, said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Ezra Blackwood approaching on foot, flanked by 4 armed men. But there was something different about him now. A tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a man whose carefully laid plans had hit an unexpected obstacle. "Mr. Montgomery," Blackwood said with forced civility, "I've had time to consider your ... proposition." Montgomery smiled pleasantly. "Excellent. And what conclusion have you reached?" Blackwood's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "The water rights issue is problematic for my operations. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation." "I'm sure we can," Montgomery agreed. "But first, I think Sheriff Wade owes young Tommy here an apology. And an explanation about that planted evidence." Wade's face flushed red. "I don't have to explain nothing to nobody." "Oh, but you do," Montgomery said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You see, I've spent the last 3 days conducting my own investigation. I've spoken with several witnesses who saw your men plant that jerky in Tommy's pocket. I've also had some very interesting conversations with the Territorial Marshal's office about certain irregularities in land transfers around Cedar Ridge." The color drained from Wade's face. Behind him, Blackwood's men shifted nervously. Montgomery continued relentlessly. "It seems there's going to be a federal investigation into land fraud in this territory. Amazing how quickly these things move when you know the right people in Washington." Blackwood stepped forward, his composure finally cracking. "What do you want, Montgomery?" "Justice," Montgomery replied simply. "Tommy gets a full public apology and restoration of his good name. The families that have been driven off their land get compensation and the right to return. And Cedar Ridge gets a new sheriff, one who works for the people instead of the highest bidder. And if I refuse?" Montgomery's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then I close the water rights to Copper Creek. Every stream that feeds your mining operations, every source of water for this town, gets cut off. Your mines become worthless holes in the ground, and Cedar Ridge becomes a ghost town." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the two powerful men faced each other in the dusty street. Finally, Blackwood nodded curtly to Wade. "Sheriff, I believe you owe the boy an apology." Wade looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. The charges against Tommy Sullivan are hereby dropped. There may have been some confusion about the evidence." "Louder," Montgomery said pleasantly, "so everyone can hear." Wade raised his voice. "Tommy Sullivan is innocent of all charges. The evidence was ... planted." A murmur ran through the crowd, growing into angry voices as people realized the full scope of the injustice that had been done. Tommy felt tears stinging his eyes, but they were tears of vindication rather than sorrow. He looked up at Montgomery, who placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "What happens now?" Tommy asked quietly. Montgomery's expression softened. "Now you have choices, son, real choices. You can come work for me at the ranch, learn the business, maybe even go to school back east if you want. Or you can stay here in Cedar Ridge, which I suspect is going to become a much better place to live very soon." Tommy looked around at the faces of the townspeople, people who had looked away when he was falsely accused, but who were now smiling at him with genuine warmth and approval. He thought about the ranch by Copper Creek, about the endless possibilities that Montgomery's generosity had opened up for him. But mostly, he thought about Rex, who was now playing happily with some of the local children, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook with joy. "I think," Tommy said slowly, "I'd like to spend some time at both places, the ranch and the town. Someone needs to make sure justice keeps getting done around here." Montgomery laughed, a rich sound that echoed off the adobe buildings. Spoken like a true man of the West, Tommy Sullivan. "I think Samuel Hartwell would have been proud." As the sun set over Cedar Ridge that evening, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Tommy sat on the porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house with Rex beside him. In his pocket was a letter of employment from Montgomery Railroad Holdings, and in his heart was something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope for the future. The last stand of Cedar Ridge hadn't been a battle fought with guns and violence, but with justice and the simple truth that sometimes, when good people have the power to act, they can change everything. Tommy scratched Rex behind the ears and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities too. Make a difference. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he was exactly where he belonged: home.